When you're ready.
Standardized testing. Are standardized tests an accurate measure of intelligence? Well, in short, no. Standardized tests are an inaccurate measurement of intelligence and end up harming the student's perception of tests.
Some alternatives to standardized testing are game-based assessments, which engage a higher order of thinking. They're fun and engaging for students, but students tend to get distracted by the games. Stealth assessments, such as Khan Academy, give students small, easy-to-learn lessons, and they show students' growth over time. But students tend to get distracted by the lessons and skim through and not fully understand the concepts. Random inspections are when a random inspector comes into the classroom and follows the lesson, teacher, and student plan. But students and teachers tend to act differently when there's a stranger in the room.
So I'm going to go over the brief history of standardized testing. So first off, we're going to start in 1845. This is when the very first written tests came to schooling instead of oral. This helped so that more students could take more tests at the same time, and this also helped for placing students at their preferred and more beneficial education level. Then we go on to 1901. This is the very first entrance exam was created by the College Board. This was used for colleges just specifically for entrance purposes, and then it was later used in high schools to help new and transfer students get placed in their classes. Then we'll go on to World War I. The very beginning of World War I, a test called the Army Alpha Beta test was invented that tested a bunch of recruits to see exactly where they would be placed in the military and what their main job would be during World War I. Post World War I, a huge standardized test was created to figure out all of the servicemen and women where exactly they would go after the war and find their own place in society. Then we go to 1926, which the man who actually created the Army Alpha Beta test, Carl Brigham, designed the SAT that we all know and love. And this was created just for entrance purposes for high-tier colleges, which Harvard later turned into a scholarship exam that they could take. Then in 1959, we have the ACT that was made to go strictly against the SAT, so it would remove the cognitive reading and writing and add more of a scientific and mathematical aspect of thinking. This was also the first standardized test that was made on a national level. Then we go to 1965. This is the ESEA, or the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. This was made to give low-income schools more money, thus giving the government slightly more power over what they wanted schools to be doing. Then we go to 2001. We have the No Child Left Behind Act, which gave the government even more power over what schools were doing. Thus, they gave the option of the better the test scores, the more bonus money schools would get. And then this actually altered a lot of things for teachers and schools. Then we have the college test ban, which is in 2015. Two colleges started to ban the standardized testing because they felt that students did not want it. And then later that year, almost 250,000 students came out and said that we're not taking this test because teachers were getting evaluated on their own students' performance, meaning that teachers were teaching to the test.
When faced with a challenge that your body perceives as insurmountable or very difficult to achieve, cortisol is released into the brain. Cortisol is a hormone that is responsible for stress. When given standardized tests, students' cortisol levels are above average. This can have an effect on test performance. Some symptoms of stress include headaches, stomach pains, low energy, aches and pains, and much more depending on the severity. Obviously, under these circumstances, it is highly likely that the results will be inaccurate. One survey from 2015 reported that 76% of psychologists from New York's more than 600 school districts claim that state tests cause more anxiety than local tests. This shows just how widespread test anxiety is and how many children it affects. In a similar survey, scientists found that about 11% of the children surveyed reported severe psychological and physiological symptoms tied to the assessments. This shows the severity of the stress and how it can turn into more than just stress, as they describe it, severe psychological and physiological symptoms. Poverty can also have an effect on cortisol levels. As seen in the graph, the yellow line represents below median poverty students and the blue dashed line represents above median poverty students. And in the low stakes testing category, you can see both lines are very similar, and although there's some cortisol being released, they're still within average levels. But in the high stakes testing, you can see that the yellow line is very greatly, which means these below median poverty students are being affected more by stress, while the blue dashed line is very similar. This begs the question of whether the cycle of poverty is in play. Kids coming from impoverished areas are much more likely to experience stress during testing, and thus are less likely to perform to their full ability. So what does this mean for their future? Say a kid coming from an impoverished area scores low on a test, and then he doesn't get into college. He will then not receive a degree, meaning he will most likely work a low-income job, and then he will raise his kids in the same impoverished conditions. So these kids are being trapped within the cycle and are being failed by a system far too easily affected by uncontrollable factors. Some school districts have experimented with the idea of the alternative testing methods we mentioned previously, such as the game-based assessments. Those that have seen less anxiety, stress, and overall just better attitudes towards testing. The brain views them as low stakes, and as a result, less cortisol is released into the brain. Ultimately, for universally accurate results, alternative methods must be the future of testing.
So, the scientific lens. We decide that standardized tests are both unfair and unethical towards all students, especially those with learning disabilities, such as ADHD and dyslexia. 18% of all students have some sort of learning disability. Students with ADHD have a hard time focusing and concentrating for the long hours required for standardized tests. Students with dyslexia have a hard time reading and comprehending the questions and answers. Expectations for teachers. Some teachers are given monetary rewards for high-scoring students, which incentivizes them to teach to the test. Teaching to the test is where teachers take time out of core classes such as gym, art, recess, and music to spend more time studying. If a student performs poorly on a test, it is not a reflection of the teacher. 16% of all students are naturally low test scores. Expectations for students. Students are expected to sit and endure the long hours of standardized tests. The few breaks that are given don't properly allow the students to recharge. The breaks that are given are 10 minutes long, and while they should be 25 to 35 minutes long. 4 to 8% of all students with learning disabilities have their accommodations ignored. Standardized tests are just that, standardized. They don't take into consideration outside factors in home life. So this is a graph showing the number of standardized tests taken per year from pre-K to 12th grade, and you can see a constant upward trend. And this is the number of hours spent on standardized tests per year by grade, again, from pre-K to 12th grade.
In conclusion, we believe that standardized tests are an inaccurate measurement of intelligence and end up harming the student's perception of tests. And alternative solutions should be used instead.
Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you. Emerson, reflecting on your colleagues' work, which of the arguments had the greatest impact on your overall understanding of the problem your group identified?
I would say Mason's, because it has, we learned about the cortisol hormone and the effects of stress on the body and how that can truly change a student's results and as well as their outcomes in the test.
Okay, thank you. Ben, what is a way in which your team's resolution makes you think differently about your own individual research?
So the final resolution of ours was the alternative tests would have been a better option. And that changed a lot of my research because I was strictly going for, I was originally going to start like a couple centuries ago, like 400 BC, but then I kind of wanted to tidy it up a little bit to more recent because more recent's kind of when everything started to change. And so then when Emerson brought up like all the new technology, all the new research to what's being developed, I think that's how I chose to stay in the more present.
Okay, thank you. Mason, describe an argument from one of your peers' individual reports that made you think differently about your team's solution or conclusion?
I would say Emerson's with the ethical perspective, because he highlighted how kids with disabilities are at a massive disadvantage, and that further strengthened my research and our solution as a whole.
Okay. Thank you. Another round of applause.